Hi, I'm Janice Semenyuk with 360 Alberta, and joining me here at Festival Place is Canadian military author Ted Barris.
Hi.
This Friday, joining Ted Barris will be fellow historian David O'Keefe for an evening of reflection and discussion with From Dieppe to D-Day. And Rush to Danger is your 19th book.
Correct.
What set you on the path to writing this one?
Rush to Danger began as an idea that I shared with my publisher, HarperCollins, Patrick Crean, some years ago about trying to do something with my dad's story. My dad being a medic in the Second World War, in the American Army, by the way. In the bloodiest campaign the Americans waged in Europe, the Battle of the Bulge in 1944-45, that's where he was, my dad. And when I began talking to Patrick, my publisher, about this, he said, we've got to find a way of getting that story out there because you've been living with this thing for a long time. And then I have a library of thousands of interviews I've done with nurses and ambulance drivers, stretcher bearers, surgeons, dentists, orderlies, all military medical people whose stories I've never used before. So I decided to use my dad's story as a jump off to all these other stories, whether they're 1862, the Battle of Fredericksburg, where the first field ambulance was invented, or 2010, and a flight surgeon named Dane Harden is talking about putting a guy back together again in the back of a Black Hawk helicopter while it's screaming across the desert to get him to a doctor. So these stories are anecdotal. It's not comprehensive. It's not the definitive story of military medicine, but it's offering a sense of what makes medical people tick.
And how are you able to reach out? How did you find the subjects for your interviews?
Well, over the years in writing 19 books, I have a lot of contacts. And people have come to me saying, I got a story, you got to talk to my friend Fred. Susan, the nurse down the road here, has never been interviewed. Whatever. And that wonderful additional, that research tree, if you like, comes back to me all the time. And people trust me to be fair, to be thorough, to be personal, to help give history a face that it doesn't necessarily have. We all know the big stories about Dieppe and D-Day, but the small human stories of the individuals are what I'm interested in, and that's what I've been telling for 40 some years.
And were you a fan of MASH by any chance?
I was indeed. It was a great television show, ran from 1972 to 1983, 11 years, 256 episodes, and all those wonderful characters, funny as hell, but they were also well schooled in the history of the Korean War and the medicine that they were mimicking in the show. In other words, it wasn't just a platform to do shtick. It wasn't just a bunch of gags. After they had the success, after Larry Gelbart, who wrote the screenplay for the movie, after the success of that, they said, let's make a sitcom out of this, and they began developing the first season. And Gelbart realized that in order to do this right, he had to do the research. So he started interviewing Korean War veterans of the MASHs. These are mobile medical units. And so he started interviewing patients and doctors and orderlies and nurses and so on. And from those interviews, they built the basis of those 11 seasons of MASH. So it's all based on history made funny. And ironic, because that was the time when the Vietnam War was on, and it was very much an anti-war flavored show.
And speaking of funny, this question is going to come right out of left field, but Ted, I have to ask you. What is your connection to the 1970s children's show, The Hilarious House of Frightenstein?
Well, these things happen in very strange moments in your life, and I was very young when that began in the late 60s, or at least the idea of it. A dear friend of mine who was a writer as well, and he and I were both broadcasters, Ross Perigo, we were invited to a really stylish house in West End, Toronto, on a fall night, and I think it was 1970. And there were two producers there. In fact, they were brothers, and you know their names. They are?
Mitch and Mark?
Markowitz.
Markowitz.
And we had been invited because we told him we were writers. Okay. So we went out to this mansion and we sat down in these big cane wingback chairs, and he was sitting there in a terry towel robe with a cigar. And Perigo and I were scared out of our wits. Who the heck is this guy? He's a producer. So he said, we're going to invent a television show for kids. Okay. So Ross and I start riffing. This idea, this character, this plot, riffing, while Markowitz's secretary, who was dressed, I hasten to add, in nothing but a bikini, he won't remember that, we did, and she's making notes on everything we're saying. So we gave them the framework for the Hilarious House of Frightenstein, the castle, the moat, the three-toed sloth, Igor, Dr. Petvet, all that stuff we riffed on, coming up with these ideas, and it was kind of funny and fun. Then, after having built this stage figuratively with words and ideas and images in our heads and so on, and with the notes that the lady was making note of, we then began to write the scripts for the show. And at some point, Ross Perigo and I said, okay, how are you going to pay us? Because we just invented this show here tonight. And he said, how about we pay you $3 a joke? And that's what we got paid.
My goodness. And what year was that?
1970. We weren't too smart then. We were not very bright. We had no agents. We weren't members of ACTRA when we should have been. And we were sort of winging it because that's what people did in those days. And that's what this whole production was in that early stage, was winging it.
Well, I think there is a whole generation that would thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much for joining us today,
Pleasure.
Ted. Tickets for From Dieppe to D-Day are still available by going to www.festivalplace.ab.ca or by calling the box office. I'm Janice Semeniuk with 360 Alberta.